Final Cut for the iPad is here. That feels really good to say. I got early access to Final Cut Pro for the iPad and have been using it for about 2 weeks now. At the time of recording this, I've edited about 3 full YouTube videos and a bunch of different test projects and montages and stuff. So I've had some real hands-on time with it and I have a lot of thoughts on it. So let's get into it. Final Cut for the iPad is very much a version 1.0. And there are some good things and some bad things about that. What I mean about it being a version 1.0 is that it's not a port of the desktop version. Yes, Final Cut has been around for years, but this is kind of a start over because it's designed and built for the iPad. It's not just taking the desktop port over, which is good because you're using something that's optimized for the device you're on, and you're not fighting it to kind of force it to be, oh, hey, I know you're kind of the Mac version, but let me try and hit these small touch targets anyways. It's not like that. There are some specific features for the iPad version that will probably never come to the Mac version because they just don't make sense there. It's designed for the iPad. This is stuff like the jog wheel, Apple Pencil animations, and being able to capture footage inside of Final Cut. But because it's not the desktop version, there's a lot of features that are missing that you might expect to be there, especially if you're really used to the desktop version. A couple that really jumped out to me was the lack of stabilization, optical flow, user-created effects presets, markers, and support for third-party LUTs. But don't worry, camera LUTs are in there. A lot of Final Cut Pro for the iPad will feel familiar if you've used Final Cut for the Mac. But there's some stuff in there that are slightly tweaked that does make a lot more sense since it's on an entirely different platform. But one of the tweaks I'm actually the most excited about is some of the terminology. So for example, the library on the Mac version is now what's called a project in the iPad version. And what was a project in the Mac version is now just called a timeline or a video, but it's called a timeline in the app. Libraries always confused me, to be honest. It never really made much sense as a terminology, but now that I know okay, this is a project, and in a project you can have multiple videos that share assets, that makes sense to me. So one of the ways that I have been using this on the iPad is I have a 2-part Mac apps video I've been working on. I filmed both parts at the same time, all the A-roll, all the B-roll, everything was filmed together. So I created one project for them and imported all the media. Then I created 2 timelines, one for each video. Now those timelines have access to all the media for both parts because of the way I imported it. It just works out really nice, so that way I can share assets between them all. Speaking of importing media, it works very similarly to the default behavior of the desktop version of Mac Final Cut. There's an import button at the top where you can hit it and you can choose to import from the Photos app or the Files app. Of course, from files, you can add stuff from SD and CF Express cards, external drives, NASs. Basically, the general rule of thumb is if you can access it from files, you can import media from it. Now, when you import media into your project, it imports it into the Final Cut app. That's where the actual video files or the media files will live. Now, I see this as both a positive and a negative. There's some good and some bad here. This means you don't have to worry about copying stuff to local storage first if you're using something like SD cards or CF Express cards. You don't have to worry about copying it to the iPad first. It just imports straight into your project and it can live there. But this does mean you can't edit from something like external drives. You have to use internal storage. Now, I have a serious beef, and one day I will share the story on here, but this video is already gonna be long enough. But I have a serious issue with editing video off of an external drive. I just will not do it. I refuse to do it. So while this isn't something that I particularly care about, I know a lot of people out there are going to care about this because not everyone is buying 1 or 2 terabyte iPad Pros. My biggest issue with the way media imports are handled isn't the lack of external drive editing. It's actually the lack of Time Machine or some sort of proper local backup system for the iPad. So if something was to go wrong with my iPad, or it was to get stolen or broken or something like that, and I was in the middle of a project, I would have to hope it was backed up to iCloud, which it does not back up to iCloud very frequently. And then I would have to go and restore the whole image of the iPad to another iPad, or I would, if like a project got deleted or corrupted or something on here, not that that's happened, I'm just using that as a what if scenario. If something like that happened, I would have to restore the whole image of the iPad. There's really no way to just restore a file or just a project or a timeline to the iPad. It's an all or nothing thing right now. I'm really hoping with WWDC right around the corner, we're about to see a proper backup system introduced for the iPads so that this isn't really a concern anymore. All that being said, it is really easy to export your Final Cut project to something like a NAS or an external drive. Just hit the share button and select Final Cut Pro for iPad project. The project media panel should seem familiar to anyone that has used a non-linear editor before. When selecting clips, you can open up the inspector pane. Here you can enable camera LUTs, turn on a color space override, and see all the metadata for that clip. Now, one thing that did trip me up is the lack of control over multiple clips at a time. You can select multiple clips. First, you have to hit the select button, and then you can either use your finger and drag select multiple clips, or then you can use the band selection stuff with a keyboard and trackpad and all that stuff, like command clicking. But if you have a keyboard and trackpad and all that stuff connected ahead of time, you can't just do those band selection shortcuts without hitting select. That was the first thing that was kind of weird. The second thing is once you select multiple clips, there's no way of applying like a camera LUT to a group of clips. You have to do it individually. Same thing with making like volume changes. So a lot of times I will go in and just like in my B-roll shots, I'll turn the volume all the way down because they're B-roll shots. You don't want to hear the background music that I have playing while I'm shooting B-roll. This is what slowed me down the most when it came to all of my edits, because I was having to manually go in and make these changes for every single clip. When scrubbing through clips in the media panel, you can set in and out points. This is key to how a lot of editors work. If you have a keyboard attached, you can use the I and O keyboard shortcuts. Setting these points allows you to grab just that part of the clip to add to your timeline. Once you have a clip selected you want to add to your timeline, you can use the position commands to drop that clip where you want. You can also drag and drop a clip as well, but any editor will tell you to learn those position commands. Final Cut for the iPad also has the corresponding Q, W, and E keyboard shortcuts for those position commands. For those that like to organize their clips, and this should be everyone, you can favorite, reject, and even tag clips. You can then filter your clips using these or other metadata. The magic timeline is of course in the iPad version of Final Cut. Now, I love the magic timeline, but the magic timeline next to like frame rate preferences are probably the things film editors fight the most about. I will fully admit it does take a bit of getting used to, but once you're used to it, you get incredibly fast with it. For those that aren't aware, the magic timeline allows clips to kind of snap together. So if you pick one up, it picks up everything that's connected to it. This way you can rearrange groups of clips quickly. In the timeline setting, you can disable the snap feature that pushes clips and tracks right next to each other. This makes it so that there is no blank frames in your timeline. Personally, I leave this enabled. If you're somebody that doesn't want the timeline moving stuff around for you, then you can enable the position feature. If you move or delete a clip from the main track, this will leave a blank clip behind. This is so that the timing of your project doesn't get shuffled around. Final Cut for the iPad has a few different features for editing clips as well. First, there are 3 select modes: Clip, Range, and Edge. Clip is the one that will be the most commonly used one. When you click or tap on a clip, it just selects it. You can then drag it around or delete it. Range allows you to set a certain time range. You can then drag that through your time and select specific time groups of clips. Edge will select the edge of 2 clips at first, so you can either quickly retime them or add an effect or whatever you want. If you keep tapping though with edge selected, it will select the first clip's edge only, and then it will select the second clip's edge only. When I was editing, 90% of the time I just had it on clip. One of my favorite ways to edit is using 2x playback. This speeds everything up, and when you have a long video, especially like this one, and you're chopping it all up, it really helps make that go a bit faster. My pal Chris over on the Daily Tech YouTube channel introduced me to this last year at WWDC. When playing a video, hit the right double arrow button to speed up playback. You can also hit L twice on the keyboard to do this. You can go faster than 2x if you want, but I can't understand what I'm saying faster than 2x. When cutting up tracks, you have the split tool at the bottom. With a keyboard attached, it's the shortcut Command B. When you make a cut, you can use the buttons next to the split tool to delete the clip that's either before or after the cut you just made. This really speeds up editing. Multicam editing is in Final Cut for the iPad. Now, I rarely do multicam shoots. What I've tried of this is really good. You can sync all of your clips using the audio track and edit the camera angles at any time. What I do use multicam editing for is actually linking my audio and my video together. So I have an external audio recorder, a Zoom H4n that my microphone right here just out of frame is plugged into because my camera doesn't have XLR. So what I do is I import my video, I import my audio, and I use the multicam feature to sync them together. I edited nearly a 30-minute A-roll clip the other day, and there wasn't any drift whatsoever. And for those that aren't aware, when you kind of do that syncing of clips, sometimes the audio will get out of sync with the voice. I didn't notice an issue at all. There is also the ability to transform clips with position, scale, rotation, anchor point, crop, and distort. These are all a part of the inspector page and in pretty standard stuff, but really important to have. You can also retime clips for slow motion or speeding things up. If you film something at a higher frame rate, you can use the automatically retime feature to get it to slow down to your project's frame rate. Another feature I use a lot is reverse clip. Sometimes I film too many like panning left to right shots, and I use this to mix those up. In this area, you can even insert a freeze frame. That way, if you want a classic mid-air jump freeze, you can get it. The effects and transition pages are fairly standard. You will of course find dissolves, blurs, distorts, and even some objects here. There are some built-in stylized transitions as well, along with some powerful mask and chroma key effects. There is an extremely powerful effect in Final Cut that will actually go in, find the subject of your video, and then remove the background from it. It's super impressive, but what's even more impressive is just how quickly it does it. It's like the icing on the cake. It's incredibly fast. You can then go in and add your own background or use some of the built-in ones if you wish. For titles, there's a pretty standard range of presets here. What is nice is they are really customizable so you can make them fit your project and your look. I've been using the essential lower third one in my videos, but there are more stylized options as well. I follow the keep it simple stupid method when it comes to titles and stuff. What I'm really waiting for though is third-party plugin support. This was announced alongside the Final Cut announcement a couple weeks ago. It's going to be a part of a future update. It is not here today. But for me, I like to use third-party plugins. One, it gives you more variety of choices from what you can pick from, but also it kind of helps you stand out a bit from everybody else that's using just the default titles. One of the biggest curveballs thrown at me for using Final Cut on the iPad was the color grading tools. Final Cut has some preset color grade options, but they are a bit too over the top for me. I use the color adjustment effect to manually color grade my footage. Now this requires using a bunch of sliders, and I really hope the three-way color selector comes to the iPad at some point, because that is the proper way to grade in Final Cut. Luckily though, Final Cut for the iPad does have video scopes. I really like the waveform one, but I know everyone can get a little picky about this. But this way I can properly color grade my footage. Now the benefit of having one of the M-Series 12.9-inch iPad Pros is I can go and enable reference mode, which gives you a perfectly calibrated display for color grading video. This was one of those things that was announced at WWDC last year that made me go, huh, Final Cut's coming to the iPad. There are also a handful of audio effects as well, But in the inspector panel, there is an effects tab where you can apply enhancements and the most popular effects. Here you can enable features like voice isolation, noise removal, and loudness. Loudness is great if your audio is too quiet. It bumps it up to the proper decibel level. Voice isolation and noise removal are key if you are recording in a place where you can't control the background audio. I actually used this at WWDC last year. I was filming in front of the Apple store, and it like completely cut out like the sound of a bus and a bunch of people and stuff. It worked out really well. You can also apply a compressor and a single band EQ effect here as well. Now, if you want to use multiple band EQ effects, you can actually apply this effect and the compressor as well as many times as you want. Keyframing is of course here in Final Cut, but it's a little bit different than the Mac version, and I actually really like that. You now have a separate animation timeline you enable when keyframing. When you're ready to animate, go to the first frame where your animation will start and switch the animation timeline to the effect you wish to edit. I'm gonna use position for this example. Enable a keyframe at the bottom. I find it's easiest to just drag the media to where you want it to go, but you can use the inspector panel to get precise. Then move the playhead to where you want the next or the final frame to be and move your object again. You can animate multiple effects at once without having to change the animation timeline. So for example, let's go back to our first keyframe and change the scale. Then go to our last keyframe and change the scale again. Now, when we play back, both position and scale will change on playback. You can switch the animation timeline to the scale to see those keyframes now. The biggest hurdle of this is just remembering how the animation timeline view works. But once I got my head around that, I sped through this. So it is gonna take a minute to get used to, but once you do, it's a piece of cake. With Final Cut for the iPad, we got the ability to do custom animations with the Apple Pencil. Put the playback head on the frame you wish to animate, then hit the pencil button up top. Here you get full access to the Pencil Kit toolset. Draw on the frame whatever you wish to animate and hit the done button when you're finished. You're now gonna get a new layer with that animation. You can move this around to any spot in your timeline and change the length of the animation. You can also go into the inspector and change how long it takes for it to animate. Everything about this renders instantly. It's extremely impressive just how fast animations go from ideas to being in your project. This was something we used to do back in my high school film school program that was over 15 years ago, and this would have been a whole day's worth of work right here. It's also such a great use for the Apple Pencil. Back on Final Cut for the Mac, I actually paid a lot of money in the past for some templates that would look like hand-drawn animations for something, and now I can just quickly do it myself. The jog wheel is another feature that is really well thought out specifically for the iPad. The issue that this is solving is when you're touching the screen to edit videos, we have these big meaty sausages for fingers, and they aren't nearly as precise as a cursor. What the jog wheel allows you to do is speed through a timeline to get where you want, but also you can go super slow so you can get the precise frame that you want. This is such a great feature when editing in tablet mode, but when I attach a trackpad, I can just turn it off. Now, the jog wheel isn't just for moving through the timeline. If you have a clip selected, you can enable the nudge mode. This will allow you to slide that clip anywhere in the timeline. In the media panel, you can use the jog wheel to find the frame you want to set for the in and out points. And once you find that specific frame, there are in and out point buttons right next to the jog wheel for you to use. I would love for Apple to make a physical jog wheel. Like, I love this feature so much. It would be great to have a physical one when I'm working with a keyboard and trackpad, or even working with the Mac version of Final Cut. The jog wheel is just incredibly thought out, and whoever designed it and came up with it, they deserve a raise. If you have an M2 iPad Pro, you have the Apple Pencil hover feature. I love using this when I'm editing in tablet mode. It became another substitute for the cursor. I can move the playhead through the timeline or scrub through media clips in the viewer. Just a really handy thing to use. Since the iPad has a good camera attached to it, Apple gave us the ability to capture footage right inside Final Cut. It's similar to the standard camera app with a few pro features. There's the ability to adjust the white balance and the exposure, and you can also change between autofocus and manual focus. There's also record modes for recording normal frame rates or high frame rates for slow motion. Now, this isn't something I see myself using often. Filming with a 12.9-inch iPad Pro is awkward, but sometimes even I forget to film a specific clip for something. Or maybe I came up with an idea later and I put all my gear away and it's just like, oh, I don't want to get all this stuff back out. It's just this one little clip. I just want to film it. I could see myself using this to film that pickup shot just really quickly and getting it into the timeline. One thing that this has me hoping for is that Apple's going to make a pro video camera app for the iPhone that gives us all those white balance and exposure and focus controls, but also gives us log support for the iPhone as well. Another feature that blew my mind in Final Cut for the iPad was soundtracks. Yes, music. What makes these awesome is that you can drag and retime them to any part that you want. You can make them as long as you want, you can make them as short as you want, and the music automatically adjusts to fit that new time length. No more having to find that right spot to cut and splice two of the same audio tracks together. I can't tell you the hours, days maybe, that I have wasted doing that. If this was its own separate service, like, hey, you can get unlimited length music, I would pay a lot of money every month for that. Finding music and getting it to fit video projects is ridiculously hard. My one complaint about this feature though is while there's a lot of different categories, the track selection is limited. So my hope is now that Final Cut has moved to a subscription pricing model, Apple and the Final Cut team have the revenue coming in for that project to justify hiring more artists and building out that library even more. There are a few different panels that you're gonna be opening up while working in Final Cut. And even on a 12.9-inch iPad Pro, it can start to feel really cramped fast. I wish I had an iPad Air or an 11-inch iPad Pro here so I could try these apps on them. I don't, but honestly, I couldn't imagine trying to work on that size iPad because even on the 12.9-inch one, it starts to feel cramped. The tip I will give to kind of help fix that cramped feeling is make sure you go into Settings, Display, and enable the More Space Screen Resolution feature. That will give you a lot more space to work in. While I'm working in Final Cut, I've built a habit already of just making sure I don't leave any unnecessary windows open. If I don't need the inspector or if I don't need waveforms, I'm making sure I'm closing them. And that can kind of help with making sure you're not feeling like, okay, I've got too much going on in here, everything's super cramped, the view screen's really small. That can really suck. Now, if you do need all of that open, you could actually go back into the Playback viewer controls and enable picture-in-picture mode and move the viewer around wherever you want. And of course, you can make the viewer full screen for project review as well. Speaking of windowing, this was the thing that surprised me the most. When you plug it into an external monitor, Final Cut for the iPad is locked to the iPad's aspect ratio. Now you can still use it in the typical Stage Manager way, you can have other apps open alongside it, but you cannot drag it to be 16:9. It is stuck at that 4:3 aspect ratio, and even if you resize it from the default window and blow it up as big as you possibly can, it's just scaling up. It's not giving you any more real estate, it's just making everything slightly bigger. The only other app that I have seen this behavior with is DaVinci Resolve. So it makes me believe that there's something going on with the way these apps are built, that they just don't have that proper scaling and windowing just yet. Maybe we might see something in iPadOS 17. I don't know that, but those are the only two apps that I've seen this with. It is a bit disappointing because having that 16:9 aspect ratio on an external monitor, especially something like the studio display, that would have really helped with that cramped workspace feeling. Another thing that really surprised me was the lack of multi-clip effect editing. So for example, there is no way to take a color grade effect from one clip and apply it to all the other clips in your timeline at once. You have to manually go in and copy that effect and then paste it to every single clip one at a time. And there is currently no keyboard shortcuts for copying and pasting effects. This really slowed me down. I've mentioned a few already, but Final Cut Pro does have support for keyboard shortcuts. Like all iPad apps, just go in and hold down the command key to see a list of all of them. They should be pretty much the same as the Mac version. One thing I would love to see in a future update though is support for creating custom keyboard shortcuts like the Mac version has. I know myself and a lot of other editors have done that to basically help speed up our workflows. Slows me down a bit, but the real thing that slows me down is the lack that I can't copy and paste effects to a bunch of clips at once. Just like the Mac version, there is background rendering to help speed up your final render and improve performance playback. I've been using the M2 2TB iPad Pro, and that one has 16 gigs of RAM. I never had to stop and wait for the background render process, nor did I really have any major performance playback issues. The quality dipped every once in a while, but I also went in like right away to the view options and changed the playback performance to quality. I do this even on the Mac version. I cannot stand the performance playback. The performance I'm getting out of this is really impressive. I have multiple clips stacked on top of each other. I'm using the base current Apple Silicon processor, not the Pro, not the Max, not the Ultra, just the M2 one. The iPad doesn't have a fan. I'm editing 10-bit 4K H.265 footage from my Canon R5 that I'm color grading. And anyone that knows, Canon R5 footage isn't like lightweight stuff, that's heavy duty. With Final Cut for the iPad, you can export your projects from your iPad and send them to the Mac version of Final Cut. Now this is really great if you started while you're traveling, or if you realize, hey, this video project is just becoming a lot bigger and I need something with a bit more power, you can send it over to the Mac. Unfortunately, you cannot go the other way, which is actually the way I would probably want to go, because what I could see myself doing a lot is, hey, I'm working on this project, I have a trip coming up, I didn't finish editing it before the trip, let me send this to my iPad so I can just take my iPad with me on the trip. So who is Final Cut for the iPad for? It's not for Hollywood. Just straight off the bat, it's not, you're not gonna see the next James Cameron movie edited on the iPad. That's not gonna be the thing. Besides, Hollywood moved on from Final Cut after the 7 to 10 transition back in the day, so this isn't for them. This is for the independent creators, the people that are working on the go, and the people that are just getting started. This is for the people like me. And that's really exciting. This is from people that wanna work from a computer that can transform to what their needs are, whether it's a tablet, a laptop, or a desktop. Now, there is a lot of pushback about the fact that Final Cut and Logic are going subscription, and I don't see this as a bad thing. These are the apps that should be subscriptions. They are professional creative apps. When I was starting my YouTube channel, I was broke. I set $100 aside. That was all I could afford for gear for my starting a YouTube channel. I bought a mic and screen recording software, and I had the base 2014 MacBook Pro that I had put on a credit card that I could not afford. At that time, there was absolutely no way I could afford to drop $300 for Final Cut. I had to use other methods. Back in the day when I originally learned Final Cut, which was in the version 7 days, I believe it cost $700 then. So it was even more back then. So $5 a month or $50 a year, putting myself back in that position of just starting off being a creator, just being an independent person, not having somebody that can give me some sort of financial backing, a company, person, whatever. $5 a month, $50 a year is exactly the kind of pricing I would have wanted for something like this. I honestly believe this pricing will give more people access to these professional creative tools and will build the next generation of creatives. Now, if you're on the fence about Final Cut or Logic, there's a free 1-month trial. So you can try it for 1 month and not have to give Apple a dime. You can just see if it's for you or if it's not. But at the end of the day, Final Cut and Logic are both professional creative tools. They are products designed for creatives to use for a job that will probably, potentially, most likely make them money. Final Cut on the iPad does have some heavy system requirements. It does require an M series iPad. This could be an M1 or M2 iPad Pro or iPad Air. And I get why it's this way. They're not limiting what you can do with this. They're not limiting the amount of video tracks you can have or leaving a bunch of rendering issues in the software. It works like the professional version of Final Cut because that's what it is. It's true to the Pro app name. While Final Cut for the iPad doesn't have every single feature I would like to see from the desktop version, I feel it has a strong base. Like I said, this is a version 1.0. We're looking at the base of it. It's going to get built up more. Apple's already said that there's more stuff coming, like plugin support. So it's going to get built up from here. This is just the base. And there's a lot of hope and promise in this base that I see. Now, that being said, I am going to be keeping an eye on updates. I already have timelines set up in my calendar to remind me to check on the state of Final Cut at different intervals throughout the next year. But if I can just give like a TLDR, I am extremely happy I can finally edit professional videos in my app of choice on the computer of my choice. And I'm really excited about the future of this app and the iPad as a platform. For those that are curious, because I know there's some out there, my plan right now is to keep editing everything in Final Cut on the iPad until WWDC. Once WWDC rolls around, we'll see what beta breaks what then. We'll cross that bridge when we get to it, but I try not to plan beyond WWDC. But I do want to announce right now, I am going to start working on a Final Cut for iPad tutorial series. I want people to be able to go from knowing nothing about video editing to being an expert in the app. So that's it for this video. Let me know what you think about Final Cut Pro for the iPad in the comments below, and if you have any questions about it. Thank you all so much for watching. If you liked the video, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe if you haven't already, and have a great day.